Kara's station smelled like rust and desperation, and Commander Marcus Cole had learned long ago that such places attracted the broken and the running in equal measure. He had been both, once upon a time, and perhaps that was why he noticed her when no one else did. The station sat at the edge of Consortium space, a waypoint that had seen better centuries. Its lights flickered in patterns that suggested the power grid was held together by hope and old wiring. And the corridors were filled with species from 100 worlds, all moving with the hurried steps of people who did not want to stay longer than necessary. Marcus walked through the crowd with the slow patience of a man who had nowhere urgent to be. At 62 years old, with a gray beard that needed trimming and shoulders that ached when the weather system cycled, he had earned the right to move at his own pace. The border wars were 20 years behind him, and the nightmares came less often now. Though they never fully stopped his ship, the Quiet Passage was an old cargo hauler that creaked and groaned but never failed him. She was docked at Bay 14, her fuel tanks freshly filled, and her cargo hold stocked with supplies for the outer colonies. It was honest work, hauling freight to forgotten places, and it kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. He was walking toward the food vendors when he saw her. She was sitting against the wall near Gate 7, surrounded by 3 warm bags that looked like they held everything she owned in the universe. Her scales were a faded bronze color, dull in places where they should have shone, and her wings were folded so tightly against her back that they seemed to disappear. She was thin, too thin, and her golden eyes were half closed with exhaustion, a dracont. Marcus recognized the species immediately, though he had not seen one in years. The Dracomid had once been a proud people, warriors and scholars whose homeworld had been a jewel of the Outer Rim. But that was before the Kovani Dominion had burned their planet to ash in a war that lasted only 3 months. Now the survivors were scattered across the galaxy, refugees without a home, unwanted by most and exploited by many. This one was young, barely past her species equivalent of 20, if Marcus had to guess. She wore clothes that had been mended too many times, and there was a hunger in her face that went deeper than missed meals. She was the kind of tired that came from running for too long with no safe place to stop. Marcus watched as her eyes finally closed completely and her head drooped forward. Exhaustion had won its battle, and she had fallen asleep sitting up, one clawed hand still clutching the strap of her largest bag, as if she feared someone would steal it the moment she let go. Crowds moved around her like water flowing past a stone. A group of Velith merchants in their expensive robes stepped wide to avoid her, their faces showing clear disgust. A Kovani officer in a crisp uniform looked at her and sneered before continuing on his way. No one stopped, no one spoke to her. No one seemed to see her as anything more than an obstacle. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, an old familiar feeling that he had never been able to ignore, no matter how hard he tried. He looked around and spotted what he had feared: 2 station security officers making their way through the crowd, their eyes fixed on the sleeping Dracont. They carried stun cuffs on their belts and wore the expressions of people who were about to make someone else's day much worse. Kara's station had strict rules about loiterers, and the penalties were harsh for those who could not pay the fines. The officers were getting closer, and the young woman slept on, unaware of the danger approaching. Marcus could have walked away. It was not his business, not his problem, not his responsibility. He had his own life, his own ship, his own quiet routine that kept the darkness at bay. Getting involved with strangers only led to complications. And he was too old for complications, but he was also too old to pretend he did not care. He reached into his coat and pulled out his veteran's credentials, the ones he rarely used anymore. They were old and worn but still valid, still carrying the weight of treaties signed decades ago when humanity had first joined the galactic community. He also pulled out something else, a blank set of emergency passage papers. The kind that humanitarian transport vessels were allowed to carry the officers reached the sleeping woman just as Marcus stepped between them. "This one is with me," he said, his voice calm but firm. The lead officer, a Velith with pale blue skin and 4 arms, looked at Marcus with clear irritation. "She has no ticket, no credits, and no right to be here. Station regulations require us to detain her for processing." Marcus held up his credentials and the passage papers. "Emergency humanitarian transport, authorized under the Cascadia Accords of 2847. I am invoking my right as a registered human veteran to provide passage to displaced persons in immediate need." The officer stared at the papers, then at Marcus, then at the papers again. "This is highly irregular." "It is perfectly legal," Marcus replied. "Check the codes if you need to." "I will wait." There was a long pause as the officer consulted his datapad, his expression growing more frustrated with each passing second. Finally, he looked up and gave Marcus a cold glare. "The codes are valid," he admitted through clenched teeth. "But this is your responsibility now, human. If she causes any trouble—" "She will not," Marcus said. "We will be gone within the hour." The officers exchanged looks of annoyance before turning and walking away, their stun cuffs unused. Marcus watched them go, then let out a slow breath. He knelt down beside the sleeping woman, moving carefully so as not to startle her. Up close, he could see just how young she was, how worn, how fragile beneath the scales and the claws and the wings that could breathe fire. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's hope, and the galaxy had chewed her up and was ready to spit her out. Marcus gathered her into his arms as gently as he could, lifting her like she weighed nothing at all. He was careful with her wings, making sure they were not crushed or bent. He tucked their bags under one arm and stood slowly, his old knees protesting but holding. She stirred against his chest, her golden eyes flickering open for just a moment. There was fear there, confusion, the beginning of panic. "You are safe," Marcus murmured, his voice soft. "Rest now." Her eyes searched his face, looking for something, threat or promise. He could not tell. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. Because her eyes closed again and her body relaxed against him, Marcus carried her through the station toward Bay 14, ignoring the stares from passing travelers. Let them look, let them wonder, let them think whatever they wanted. He had stopped caring about the opinions of strangers long before his hair turned gray. The quiet passage welcomed them with a soft hum of familiar systems. And Marcus laid the sleeping woman in the spare bunk with the same care he would have shown his own child. He covered her with a warm blanket, set her bags beside her where she could see them when she woke, and dimmed the lights. Then he sat down in his pilot's chair and began the departure sequence, plotting a course for human space outside the viewport. The stars waited like old friends, and somewhere in the bunk behind him, a dragon woman slept peacefully for the first time in longer than he wanted to imagine. The quiet passage moved through the darkness between stars at a speed that would have seemed impossible to humans just 3 centuries ago. But Marcus had long stopped being amazed by faster-than-light travel. Some wonders became ordinary when you lived with them long enough. And he had been flying these routes since before his beard turned gray, sat in the pilot's chair with a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the streaks of light that painted the viewport during jump travel. The ship hummed around him like a living thing, her old engines working steadily, her systems all reading green. She was a good ship, reliable and honest, and she had never let him down behind him in the small crew quarters. The dragon woman still slept. 18 hours had passed since he carried her aboard, and she had not stirred once except to shift in her sleep and mumble words in a language he did not understand. Marcus had checked on her several times, making sure she was still breathing, making sure her color was not getting worse. He had seen enough sick and starving refugees in his time to recognize the signs of someone pushed to their absolute limit. Thought about the way the other species at the station had looked at her. The disgust and the dismissal, the complete lack of recognition that she was a person in pain. It was not surprising the galaxy was a cold place, and most species had evolved past the kind of instincts that made mammals like humans so foolishly protective. But it still made something angry burn in his chest. The Dracontes had been warriors once, proud and fierce, with fire in their blood and ancient songs that told of glories spanning thousands of years. Now they were scattered dust, begging for scraps at stations that barely tolerated their presence. And the galaxy had moved on without a backward glance. Marcus knew something about being part of a species that the galaxy did not fully understand when humanity had first reached the stars and made contact with the greater galactic community. They had been dismissed as soft and sentimental, too emotional and too attached to things that did not matter. The Velith had called them primitive for their habit of bonding with animals and keeping them as companions. The Corvani had laughed at their tendency to form emotional attachments to machines and ships. The cold logic of galactic civilization had no room for creatures who named their vehicles and cried at sad stories. But then the border wars had come, and the galaxy had learned that humans were not as soft as they appeared. Marcus had been there, on the front lines, when human soldiers had done things that made the Corvani generals stare in disbelief. He had seen medics run into fire to save wounded enemies, and he had seen those same medics fight with terrifying fury when their patients were threatened. He had watched human engineers repair alien ships because the crews were hurt and could not do it themselves, asking nothing in return except the chance to help. And he had been there when the war ended, when human diplomats had insisted on rebuilding the worlds they had bombed and feeding the populations they had starved. Because winning was not enough if it meant leaving suffering behind. The galaxy still did not understand humans, and Marcus suspected they never would. How could species that had evolved toward pure logic and cold efficiency comprehend creatures who would die for strangers, who would carry exhausted refugees onto their ships, who would love and grieve and hope with an intensity that bordered on madness? A soft sound from the crew quarters pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned to see the dragon woman standing in the doorway. She was awake, her golden eyes wide and alert, her clawed hands raised in a defensive posture. There was fire kindling at the back of her throat. He could see the faint glow, and her wings had spread slightly. Ready for fight or flight, Marcus did not move from his chair, did not raise his hands, did not do anything that might seem threatening. He simply looked at her and spoke in a calm, quiet voice. "The soup is almost ready," he said, gesturing toward the small kitchen alcove where a pot was heating on the burner. "You have been asleep for 18 hours. You were dehydrated, mostly with some malnutrition underneath. I figured you could use something warm." The dragon woman stared at him, her chest heaving with rapid breaths, her body coiled like a spring, ready to release. She looked around the small ship interior, taking in the warm but clean surfaces, the humming systems, the warm lighting that Marcus preferred over the harsh brightness most vessels used. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice rough from sleep and disuse. "Aboard my ship, the Quiet Passage. We left Carey Station about 18 hours ago. We are currently in jump space, heading toward the human colonies in the Cascadia sector." Why, it was not a question with much context, but Marcus understood what she was asking. "Why did you help me? Why did you bring me here? Why would a stranger carry me onto his ship instead of leaving me to the station officers? Why would anyone do something so strange and inexplicable?" He stood slowly and moved toward the kitchen, giving her plenty of space, keeping his movements predictable and unthreatening. He ladled soup into a bowl and set it on the small table, then stepped back. "You should eat," he said. "I can answer your questions, but you should eat first." She approached the table cautiously, never taking her eyes off him. She sniffed the soup, checking for poison or drugs or whatever dangers her life had taught her to expect. And then she looked at him again with something like confusion. "You are human," she said. "Yes, humans are strange." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "So I have been told." She sat down at the table, still watching him, and after another moment of hesitation, she picked up the spoon and began to eat. Her hands trembled slightly, and she ate with the careful desperation of someone who had learned not to waste food when it was available. Not knowing when the next meal might come, Marcus poured himself another cup of coffee and sat down across from her, giving her time to eat, giving her space to feel safe. He had learned long ago that trust could not be rushed, that scared creatures needed patience more than promises, that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was simply wait. When she had finished the soup and scraped the bowl clean, she set down the spoon and looked at him with eyes that held questions she was almost afraid to ask. "Why did you help me?" she said. "What do you want from me?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, turning the coffee cup in his hands, looking at the steam that rose from its surface. He could give her the simple answer, the one that would satisfy most people. But she deserved more than that. "I had a daughter once," he said, his voice soft. "Her name was Elena. She was about your age when the Corvani raid took her from me. I searched for 3 years, spent everything I had, called in every favor, but I never found her. Never learned what happened, never got to say goodbye." The dragon woman was silent, her golden eyes wide. "I could not save her," Marcus continued. "Nothing I did was enough, and I have carried that failure with me every day since. But I can make sure that you eat something hot tonight. I can make sure that you have a safe place to sleep and a chance to reach somewhere better. I cannot change the past, but I can do something good in the present." He looked up at her, and there was no pity in his eyes, only a quiet understanding that came from shared pain. "You do not owe me anything," he said. "When we reach New Cascadia, you can walk off this ship and never look back. But until then, you are welcome here, and you are safe." The dragon woman stared at him for a long time. This strange alien creature with no scales and no claws and no fire. Just tired old eyes and hands that had carried her to safety. Then she picked up the empty bowl and held it toward him. "Is there more soup?" she asked. Marcus smiled and took the bowl. "There is always more soup," he said. Her name was Sveth, and she had been running for 2 years before she fell asleep at Karis Station. She told him this on the 3rd day of their journey, sitting in the co-pilot's chair with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a cup of something warm in her clawed hands. Marcus had introduced her to tea, and she had decided she liked it better than the bitter coffee he preferred. The story came out slowly, in pieces, like fragments of a broken mirror that she was trying to fit back together. Marcus listened without interrupting, letting her speak at her own pace, giving her the space to tell as much or as little as she wanted. She had been born on Dracone's Prime, the homeworld, but she had been only a child when the Corvani burned it. Her memories of that place were fragments, the smell of flowers in her mother's garden, the sound of her father's voice singing ancient songs, the warmth of the sun on her scales during long summer afternoons. Then there was fire and screaming and ships falling from the sky. And after that, there was only running. Her family had made it onto one of the evacuation transports. But the refugee camps were not kind places. Disease took her father within the first year, and her mother followed 2 years later, worn down by grief and the endless waiting for a salvation that never came. By the time Sveth was old enough to take care of herself, she was alone in a galaxy that had no use for her. She had tried to find work, but no one wanted to hire a Dracont. She had tried to find shelter, but the refugee settlements were overflowing and the waiting lists stretched for decades. She had tried to find hope, but hope was a luxury that cost more than she could afford, so she ran, station to station, ship to ship, selling what little she had. taking whatever work she could find, no matter how dangerous or degrading, always moving toward a distant dream that felt more impossible with each passing day. The human colonies, where rumor said her people were sometimes given shelter, sometimes given a chance. Why the humans? Marcus asked, speaking for the first time since she had started her story. Why not the Velith worlds or the Corvani territories? Sveth gave him a look that suggested the answer should be obvious. The Velith see us as beneath them, useful only for labor and servitude. The Corvani were the ones who burned our world. But humans, she paused, searching for words. Humans are strange. They take in strays. They adopt creatures and species that have nothing to offer them. They build homes for refugees and ask nothing in return. She looked at him, her golden eyes searching his face. My mother told me stories about humans before she died. She said they were the only species in the galaxy that remembered what it meant to be lost and afraid. She said they carried that memory with them, and it made them kind in ways that other species could not understand. Marcus was quiet for a moment, turning her words over in his mind. We are not all kind, he said finally. We have done terrible things, my people. We have wars and cruelty in our history that would make your scales stand on end. We are capable of great evil when we choose to be. But you carried me onto your ship, Sveth said. You did not have to. You could have walked past like everyone else. But you stopped, and you picked me up, and you brought me somewhere safe. Why would you do that if not because of kindness? Marcus did not have a good answer. Or perhaps he had too many answers and none of them felt complete. He thought about Elena, about the hole she had left in his heart that never quite healed. He thought about all the refugees he had seen over the years, all the broken people and shattered families, all the suffering that the galaxy seemed to produce in endless supply. He thought about the simple truth that he was old and tired and had no one left to care for. And maybe, just maybe, caring for someone else was the only thing that kept him from drowning in his own grief. I do not know, he admitted. I stopped asking myself that question a long time ago. I just do what feels right, and carrying you felt right. Sveth was quiet, and then she asked the question that had been building since she first woke on his ship. What do you want me to do in return? Marcus looked at her, and there was something like sadness in his eyes. I want you to eat regular meals and get enough sleep. I want you to let yourself rest without feeling guilty. I want you to believe, even if only for a few days, that the universe is not completely hostile and that there are still good things waiting for you. Ahead, he stood and moved toward the kitchen. And right now, I want you to help me make dinner, because I am getting tired of cooking for myself, and I could use an assistant. Sveth stared at him, trying to understand this strange creature who asked for nothing and offered everything. In her experience, kindness always came with a price. Generosity was always a transaction, and no one gave without expecting something in return. But this human seemed to operate by different rules. Rules that made no sense to her but felt warm and safe in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. She stood and followed him to the kitchen, and he showed her how to chop vegetables the human way, and how to season meat with spices from a planet called Earth, and how to stir a pot without burning the bottom. It was simple work, ordinary work, the kind of domestic routine that she had not experienced since her mother was alive. They ate together at the small table, and Marcus told her stories about his travels, about the strange worlds he had visited and the stranger people he had met. He made her laugh with tales of cargo gone wrong and translations gone worse, of alien customs that confused him and human customs that confused everyone else. For the first time in 2 years, Sveth felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension and fear that had been wound so tight she had forgotten it was there. She was still a refugee, still homeless, still uncertain about what tomorrow would bring. But for this one evening, on this small ship with this strange human, she was safe, and that was enough later. After dinner was finished and the dishes were cleaned, Marcus showed her how to read human star charts and how to identify the major trade routes. He showed her where New Cascadia was located and traced the path they would take to get there. He explained the immigration process and the refugee assistance programs that would be available to her. When they arrived, "You will be okay," he said, and it was not a question or a hope. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen too much suffering to offer false comfort. It will not be easy, and there will be hard days ahead. But you will be okay. Sveth looked at the star chart, at the small dot that represented the planet where her new life would begin. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself believe it. She let herself believe that she would be okay. The journey to New Cascadia would take 12 days. And somewhere around day 5, Sveth began to understand something that the galaxy whispered about, but never quite believed. Humans were fundamentally, impossibly, beautifully strange. She watched Marcus move through his days aboard the quiet passage, and everything about him confused her in ways she could not fully explain. He talked to the ship as if it could hear him, praising the engines when they ran smooth and coaxing the life support systems when they made worrying sounds. He patted the walls affectionately and called the vessel Old Girl and seemed genuinely concerned about her feelings. "The ship does not have feelings," Sveth said one morning, watching him apologize to a stubborn airlock that had taken 3 tries to open. "It is a machine. It cannot hear you." Marcus looked at her with an expression of mild amusement. "Of course she can hear me. She has been listening to me for 15 years. We understand each other. That is not how machines work." "Maybe not," Marcus agreed. "But it makes me feel better, and I think it makes her work better too. There are stranger things in the universe than talking to your ship." Sveth did not know how to respond to this logic, so she simply accepted it as another piece of the puzzle that was human behavior. She learned other things about humans during those 12 days. She learned that they had an inexplicable attachment to small rituals. The morning coffee that Marcus prepared with careful precision. The evening card games he taught her to play. The specific order in which he checked the ship's systems before going to sleep. These routines seemed to comfort him in ways that went beyond their practical purpose. As if the repetition itself was a kind of prayer. She learned that humans had a concept called home that extended far beyond physical location. Marcus showed her pictures of places he had lived: a small house on a green planet, an apartment in a city that touched the clouds, a cabin by a lake that reflected the sky, and he spoke of each one with a fondness that suggested they had become part of him, written into his memory like chapters of a book. She learned that humans formed attachments with absurd intensity and stubbornness. Marcus had kept the old blanket from his daughter's childhood bed, even though it was worn and faded. And he had preserved a small collection of paper books that his wife had loved before she passed. And he carried a photograph in his wallet of people who had been dead for decades, but whom he still loved with fresh and present grief. One evening, Sveth finally asked the question that had been building in her mind since the first day. "Why do your people care so much?" She said, "It makes no evolutionary sense. Caring for strangers weakens your resources. Forming attachments makes you vulnerable. Your species should have learned by now that the logical approach is to conserve your energy for yourself and your direct offspring." Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out the viewport at the stars that streaked past during jump travel. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful and slow. "I think it is because we know what it means to be alone in the dark," he said. "Humans evolved on a planet where everything wanted to eat us. We were not the strongest or the fastest or the most dangerous. We survived because we worked together, because we formed groups and protected each other and shared our food and our shelter and our warmth." He turned to look at her. "We remember that. Not consciously, not in our minds, but somewhere deep in our bones. We remember every hand that reached out to us in the darkness, every stranger who shared their fire, every moment of unexpected kindness that meant the difference between living and dying. Sveth listened, trying to understand, so we reach back, Marcus continued. We see someone alone and afraid, and something inside us says, that was us once, and that could be us again, and we cannot just walk past. It is not logical. You are right about that. But logic is not everything. Sometimes the most important things are the ones that make no sense at all. He smiled, and there was something wistful in it. The galaxy thinks we are foolish for this. They think our attachments make us weak. But I have seen what humans can do when they are protecting something they love. I have seen ordinary people become heroes, seen soldiers fight impossible odds, seen entire populations sacrifice everything for a cause they believed in. He shook his head. We are not weak. We are terrifying. The galaxy just does not understand that our strength comes from the same place as our kindness. Sveth thought about this for days afterward, watching the stars and thinking about a species that could destroy worlds and rebuild them, that could fight with savage fury and then weep over a fallen enemy, that could carry strangers onto their ships and ask nothing in return. She began to see patterns she had missed before. The way Marcus left extra food on her plate without mentioning it, the way he adjusted the temperature controls because he had noticed she was sensitive to cold, the way he found excuses to include her in his daily routines so she would not feel like a burden. He was caring for her. She realized, not because she could repay him, not because there was anything to gain, but simply because she was there and she needed help, and he was capable of providing it. It was such a simple thing. And yet, it was the most extraordinary thing she had ever experienced on the 8th day. She found him in the cargo hold, sorting through old supplies and making notes on a datapad. She sat down beside him without asking and began to help, organizing boxes and checking inventories, working in comfortable silence. After an hour, she spoke. I was wrong about humans. Marcus looked up. How so? I thought your kindness was weakness, she said. I thought your attachments made you soft. But I was wrong. Your kindness is strength. Your attachments give you something to fight for. You are not soft at all. You are the most dangerous species in the galaxy, because you will burn down empires to protect the things you love. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed a real laugh, warm and genuine. That is the nicest thing anyone has said about humans in a long time. Sveth allowed herself a small smile. It is also the truest. They finished sorting the cargo in comfortable silence. And when they were done, Marcus made tea, and they sat together in the small kitchen, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. Sveth thought about her mother's stories, about the rumors that had driven her across the galaxy toward human space, about the desperate hope that had kept her moving when everything else had failed. The rumors were true. She realized. Humans really were different. They really did take in strays and protect strangers and care about creatures that had nothing to offer them, and she was grateful. More grateful than she had words to express. That exhaustion had finally claimed her beside those bags at Carey Station, and that this particular human had been there to carry her to safety. 4 more days until New Cascadia. 4 more days of tea and card games and conversation with this strange, kind, impossibly human man. She found herself wishing the journey could last a little longer. New Cascadia appeared in the viewport like a jewel wrapped in clouds, blue and green and achingly beautiful. Sveth pressed her hand against the glass as the quiet passage began its descent through the upper atmosphere, watching the planet grow larger and more real with each passing moment. This was it. The destination she had been dreaming of for 2 years. The place that had seemed so impossibly far away. when she had been begging for scraps on distant stations and sleeping in cargo holds when no one was watching. It was real now, close enough to touch, and she did not know what to feel behind her. Marcus was running the landing sequence with practiced ease, his hands moving over the controls with the familiarity of 15 years of partnership with this old ship. He was humming something under his breath, a tune she had come to recognize from their evenings together, something he called a folk song from a place called Appalachia. "There is a Draconte settlement in the Eastern District," he said without looking up. "About 3,000 of your people live there now. They have established a community center and several businesses, and even a temple for the old traditions. You will not be alone." Sveth did not respond. She kept her eyes on the planet, on the clouds that were parting to reveal cities and forests and oceans that sparkled in the sunlight. "I have arranged temporary housing through the Refugee Assistance Program," Marcus continued. "Nothing fancy, but it is clean and safe and will give you time to find something permanent. I have also submitted your name for the skills matching database. They will help you find work that suits your abilities." His voice was calm and practical, the voice of someone who had done this before, who knew the systems and the processes and the steps that needed to be taken. But Sveth heard something else beneath the efficiency, something that sounded almost like reluctance. She turned away from the viewport and looked at him. He was focused on the controls, his expression carefully neutral, and she realized that she had learned to read this strange human face over the past 12 days. She could see the tightness around his eyes and the set of his jaw, the small signs that meant he was feeling something he did not want to show. "You do not want me to leave." She said it was not a question, and Marcus did not pretend otherwise. He was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I have gotten used to having someone to cook for," he admitted, "and someone to lose at cards too. And someone who actually listens when I talk to the ship, instead of looking at me like I have lost my mind." Sveth felt something warm bloom in her chest, something she had not felt since before her parents died. "I do think you have lost your mind. I simply choose not to mention it," Marcus laughed. And it was the sound she had come to treasure most during their journey, genuine and warm and full of life. The ship broke through the final layer of clouds, and the city of New Cascadia spread out beneath them. A sprawling metropolis that mixed human architecture with the styles of a dozen other species. She could see parks and gardens and waterways, towers that reached toward the sky, and neighborhoods that hugged the ground. It was beautiful and overwhelming and terrifying in the best possible way. They landed at a civilian docking port and went through the immigration procedures that Marcus had explained in detail. It was faster than Sveth had expected, smoother than any border crossing she had experienced in 2 years of running. And within an hour she was standing on solid ground with legitimate papers in her hand and a future that was actually her own. Marcus walked beside her through the port, carrying one of her bags because she had insisted on taking the others herself. They moved in silence, past travelers and merchants and families reuniting after long journeys, until they reached the exit that led to the Eastern District, and the Draconte settlement beyond Sveth stopped. This was the threshold, the border between the journey and the destination. And once she crossed it, everything would change. "Thank you," she said, and words felt completely inadequate for everything she wanted to express. "Thank you for carrying me onto your ship. Thank you for the soup and the tea and the card games. Thank you for showing me that the stories my mother told were true." Marcus shifted the bag on his shoulder and looked at her with those tired, kind eyes that she had come to trust more than anything. "It was my pleasure," he said. "You are a remarkable young woman, Sveth. You have survived things that would have broken most people, and you came through with your heart intact. Your parents would be proud." Sveth felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. Draconte were not supposed to cry, not in public, not in front of strangers. But Marcus was not a stranger anymore, and she found that she did not care about what she was supposed to do. She reached out and took his hand. This strange, clawless, scaleless human hand that had carried her to safety, and she held it tight. "You could stay," Marcus said. And there was something vulnerable in his voice that she had not heard before. "The ship is quiet with just me, and I am getting old. I could use a partner. Someone to help with the cargo runs and argue with me about talking to the engines." Svet looked at him, then looked at the city beyond the exit, at the buildings where her people lived and the future she had been running toward for 2 years. She thought about the community center and the temple and the thousands of Dracont who had made this place their home. Then she thought about the small kitchen on the quiet passage, about tea in the morning and card games in the evening, and the quiet hum of engines that she had learned to find comforting. "I will visit," she said finally, "often. I will come back and lose at cards and help you argue with the stubborn airlock and eat your terrible soup." "My soup is not terrible," Marcus protested, but he was smiling. "It is a little terrible," Svet said, "but I have grown to love it anyway." She let go of his hand and picked up her bags, all of them this time, lighter now than when she had carried them alone. She looked at him one last time, this strange human who had reached out to her in her darkest moment and pulled her into the light. "Thank you," she said again. "For everything, safe travels," Marcus replied. "I will keep the spare bunk ready." She walked through the exit and into her new life, and she did not look back because she knew that if she did, she might not be able to leave. But she carried him with her, this memory of kindness, this proof that the galaxy was not as cold as it seemed behind her. Marcus Cole stood at the exit and watched until she disappeared into the crowd. Then he turned and walked back to his ship, started the engine checklist, and plotted a course for his next delivery. But he was smiling the whole time, a real smile that reached his eyes. And somewhere in his old and weary heart, a small flame had been rekindled, a reminder that life still had surprises. That connection was still possible. That even at 62 with gray in his beard and aches in his bones, he could still make a difference. Thought about what kind of soup she might like next time, and in a galaxy of predators and empires, of cold logic and colder indifference, a dragon woman walked into her new home, carrying nothing but warm bags and a memory of being lifted up by human hands. And she knew, with a certainty that would stay with her for the rest of her long life, that she had found something more valuable than shelter. She had found proof that kindness existed, and she would carry that proof with her always.